think it went well, yeah.
We are live streaming, so FYI, this is going to be recorded. So whatever you say will be out there forever. I'm Eve Hopkins-Giola, Director of Communications for the Economic Policy Institute. Welcome, everybody. We'll be starting shortly.
I have my phone up there, so.
Oh, okay. Well,
But you can leave yours up there too if you want.
Huh?
Good afternoon. Hi everybody, thank you so much for being here and welcome to the Economic Policy Institute. I'm Naomi Walker, I'm the Executive Vice President here at EPI. We are so thrilled to have both Leah and Richard Rothstein here with us today to discuss their book, Just Action, How to Challenge Segregation Enacted Under the Color of Law, which is essentially a sequel to the best-selling Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America that Richard wrote several years ago now, and is a bestseller. So Just Action, the new book, provides a critical, action-oriented blueprint to creating more equitable communities. And so I just want to give a little bit about our speakers. First up, Leah has been a consultant on community development and affordable housing policy, practice, and finance to a range of entities, including nonprofit housing developers, cities, counties, redevelopment agencies, and even private firms. And her policy work has really been informed by her years as a community organizer with Pueblo and Californians for Justice, where she worked on housing, public safety, environmental justice, and youth leadership. And that her work has also been informed by her work as a labor organizer with the Union of Needle Trades, Industrial, and Textile Employees, otherwise known as Unite. And Richard Rothstein is a distinguished fellow here at the Economic Policy Institute and is also a senior fellow emeritus at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And so in addition to being the author of The Color of Law, he has also written a ton of other books and articles on race and education, and you can find the links to those on this page on EPI's website. So if you don't already have Just Action, you will be able to get it in the lobby after the presentation. And so now I'll turn it over to Leah and Richard to take it away.
Thank you, Naomi. Leah and I are doing a lot of speaking about this, but it's rare that I come to a room with so many of my mentors here. Thank you, Heather, Greg, Larry. So as you know, and as Naomi mentioned, I published a book in 2017 called The Color of Law that demolished the myth of de facto segregation, the idea that the reason that we're segregated in every metropolitan area of this country, blacks and whites living in separate neighborhoods for the most part, is because of people liking to live with each other of the same race, or private discrimination on the part of real estate agents or developers or banks or insurance companies, Or maybe because private homeowners or landlords wouldn't sell or rent to African Americans in white neighborhoods, or maybe because of income differences. This notion of de facto segregation is one which we all shared. I used to use the term all the time myself. It turns out there's no basis in reality whatsoever. And what I described in The Color of Law was how many federal, state, and local policies had intentionally, with racially explicit intent, created the segregated boundaries that we have in this country today. We're an apartheid society. The policies that federal government, state government, local government followed in the 20th century were so powerful that they still determine the racial landscape of today. They were all unconstitutional, blatant violations of the 5th, 13th, and 14th Amendments of the Constitution. And they've never been remedied. I'll give you one quick example. I'm just going to summarize this because we're not here to talk about my old book, but it's an important background to this about how these policies are still relevant today. Perhaps one of the more important policies was a program of the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration in the immediate post-World War II period, although it started a little bit before that, continued afterwards, to suburbanize the entire white working class and middle class population out of urban areas into single-family homes in all white suburbs. We were not a suburban country at that time. The only people living in suburbs at that time were affluent people. Whites, working class, middle class, were living in urban areas because we were a manufacturing economy. Factories needed to be located near deep water ports and railroad terminals to get their parts and ship their final products. And not only did the workers at those factories need to live in those areas as well to get to their jobs, but the banks, the insurance companies, all the service industries that service those factories also had to be located in downtown areas. Well, the federal government decided in a program that was primarily directed to returning World War II veterans, but to others who were living in those urban areas, to get the whites out of those urban areas into single-family homes in the suburbs. I won't go into detail about the origins of that program, but basically they figured that homeowners couldn't be communists, so we better move the whites into single-family homes in suburban areas. It was a racially explicit policy. In The Color of Law, I used as the example perhaps the best well-known of these, Levittown, east of New York City, 17,000 homes in one place. William Levitt, the developer, could not get bank financing for that program. Banks thought he was crazy. Nobody was going to live in the suburb, they thought. The only way he could get financing was by going to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, submitting his plans for the development, the materials he was going to use, the architectural design of the homes, and an explicit commitment never to sell a home to an African American. This was written federal policy. It wasn't the action of rogue bureaucrats in the FHA or VA. Explicit written policy. Federal Housing Administration distributed a manual to appraisers all over the country whose job it was to approve or recommend bank guarantees, federal bank guarantees for developing suburbs. The manual said explicitly you couldn't get a federal bank guarantee for a project that was going to be have African Americans in it. The manual went so far as to say you couldn't even have a bank guarantee for a loan to an all-white development that was going to be located near where African Americans were living, because in the words of the manual, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. Well, that policy brought white returning war veterans and other working and middle-class families into suburbs and to inexpensive homes. Levittown, for example, sold at that time for about, homes sold for about $8,000 a piece. In today's money, it's a little bit more than $100,000. Those homes, as you know, no longer sell for $100,000. They sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 in some parts of the country, $1 million or more. The whites who moved into those homes didn't expect to get rich by it. They were looking for a place to live. It was the appreciation of those homes over the next couple of generations was a surprise to everybody, but those whites were able to use the equity that they gained to send their children to college, to take care of temporary emergencies, maybe unemployment or medical emergencies, to subsidize their retirements, and to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren. who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited by explicit racial policy of the federal government for participating in this program that led to this wealth creation. The result is that today, African American incomes, on average, are about 60% of white incomes. African American wealth is about 5% of white wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and the 5% wealth ratio is almost entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century. And that wealth gap underlies the most serious social problems that we have in this country today. It results in the concentration of African Americans in single neighborhoods that are less well-resourced, that are less healthy, where there's more abuse by police, where the schools are less well-funded, and where they're overwhelmed by the social and economic problems of their children. This is a direct consequence of the policies that the federal government followed at that time, and they persist today. Naomi described some of my previous work here at EPI. I was an education policy writer here. That was my job here. I am grateful to Larry Michel for letting me go off on this tangent when he was president of EPI. I thought that the biggest problem schools were facing, I was really only concerned with education policy, the biggest problem schools were facing was segregated schools. And slowly it dawned on me that schools were segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. So I figured that maybe neighborhood segregation was an education problem. That's how I came to this topic. In any event, it's important, I stress over and over again in the previous book and then in this one, that these were unconstitutional policies. And the reason that's so important is that if the segregation of this country, our apartheid system, is a violation of the Constitution, then all of us Americans, of every race, every background, have an obligation to remedy it if we take our responsibilities of citizenship seriously. So I wrote this book. Everybody read it and asked me, what can we do about it now? I got tired of hearing that question. So I figured the only way to get people off my back was to write another book describing what we can do about it now. My view was that there's no political will in this country for the foreseeable future to tackle this problem at a federal level. But once you have a system that separates people the way our apartheid system does, the implementation of it, the continued consequences of it, the sustenance of it is mostly local. And there's an enormous amount that we can do in our own communities, again, as citizens and residents of these communities. There's an enormous amount we can do if we create local activist groups in local communities to address these problems. I'm going to turn it over now for a period to Leah. I'll come back later to describe what some of those things that local people can do to redress segregation in their own communities if we organize to do it. There are many, the book Just Action, our new book, describes dozens and dozens of policies, programs that sustain segregation and that can be addressed at a local level. It doesn't matter where anybody starts. The important thing is that we do something. Let me say also that 20 million people participated in Black Lives Matter demonstrations in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. They were suburban and urban. They were white and black. They were low income and middle income. They were, I said urban and suburban, yeah. It's the most diverse outpouring for racial justice that this country has ever seen, the most diverse and the largest outpouring that this country has ever seen. Yet most of the people who participated in those demonstrations went home, put Black Lives Matter signs on their lawns, maybe in their windows, and did nothing further to make Black Lives Matter. And we think that part of the reason is that they didn't know what to do. So I recruited somebody who knew more about housing policy than I did to help me co-author this book. And she did co-author the book and taught me a lot, and I'm going to turn this over to Leah Rothstein now.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having us. So I get the fun part of getting to talk about the strategies and policies that we outline in Just Action. But I'll start by saying, picking up where my dad left off, is that what we argue in Just Action is that in order to implement the wide variety of policies and strategies that we advocate for, we need a new activated civil rights movement across the country that will be working on these issues locally in their own communities. And as he said, there's a lot that can be done that's under local control that can go a long way in chipping away at the causes and consequences of segregation. So to build that, the locally based new activated civil rights movement, we need to start by building biracial, multi-ethnic groups, committees in our own communities that are working on tackling these issues. And that in itself, our first step might feel daunting. These days, more so than previous generations, or less so than previous generations, we have little social contact with people of other races outside of the workplace, in large part because we live in very racially segregated communities. So it takes a little extra effort to build these social connections and social relationships to build these biracial groups. In Just Action, we give several examples of communities across the country that have tackled these obstacles and barriers and built biracial groups. Some have sort of clever ways of doing it, but it basically comes down to just bringing people together from other race parts of town to start to get to know each other and learn that they have similar things in common and similar hopes and dreams, similar challenges, but their neighborhoods are very different. So these groups, once they're formed, often begin looking at the issue of segregation when residents in those communities discover that there's restrictive covenants on the deeds of their own homes. So these restrictive covenants, like my dad mentioned with Levittown, were one of the primary tools of the federal government in creating segregated communities. They were written into the deed of a home that said that the home could only ever be owned or occupied by whites. These covenants aren't legally enforceable anymore, but they're part of the legal documentation of a property. It's like the property line. It's in the legal documents until a legal action takes it out, which hasn't happened. So they're still on those deeds. And people have discovered these on the deeds of their own homes and been shocked to see how intentionally their own community and indeed their own home was segregated. And they started asking around. So we give some examples of Modesto, California, Rochester, New York, and Charlottesville, Virginia. In each of these places, it started with someone discovering one of these deeds. And then they started investigating. They enlisted high school students to help with the research, or they started a crowdsourcing project and documented all of the restrictive covenants in the community and developed maps. And they used those maps, overlaid them with the racial makeup of the community, and they track very closely, not surprisingly, use those maps and that historical information to create educational campaigns and to start to inspire action amongst their neighbors. Because once we see how intentionally our communities were segregated and how intentionally written into the documentation of our homes it is, we can start to see that intentional action can do something to challenge it. Because like my dad said, when we believed that segregation happened by accident, it didn't leave us anything to do about it. We thought it could only unhappen by accident. But by seeing the intentional actions that went into creating it, we can start to see that we have some agency to do something about it. So that's how a lot of these groups can get started, by educating themselves and their neighbors. And then they can start, we outline in Just Action dozens and dozens of policies and strategies that a local group can take on. We don't try to say what any group should start with or what the best policy is to start advocating for, because every community is different and every community has different challenges and opportunities and histories, slightly different histories. In this case, the history is often similar, but different ways in to start working on this issue. So I'm going to get into a couple of examples just to give you an idea of the kinds of things we talk about. And when we talk about these dozens and dozens of policies and strategies, they try to do several things. And they all are concerned with the redress of segregation. And when we say that, we mean that we need policies and strategies that look forward, that ensure that we don't continue to create and maintain segregated communities going forward, and that also look to the past and address the disparities that exist today that are the consequences of segregation and the policies that cause segregation. So our policies span those goals. They also attempt to increase resources in lower income segregated African American communities, where the concentration of poverty is the direct result of government-sponsored segregation. So to redress segregation, we have to address that consequence of segregation and increase resources in these lower income communities. And while we do that, because often when resources in lower income communities increase and investments increase, prices rise for everybody and the longtime residents are priced out and often displaced. We call that gentrification often. So we also, along with those strategies that increase those resources, need to also implement anti-displacement strategies like rent regulation or just cause eviction ordinances or inclusionary zoning that requires when new housing is built, that some of the units have to be reserved for lower and moderate income households. So there's strategies to do that. So one of the strategies, I'll just go into a little more detail, that does both of these things, increases resources in a lower income community and prevents displacement, is a community land trust. So there's about 200 communities around the country that have a land trust. They're usually a nonprofit organization. And land trusts are concerned with increasing or preserving affordable home ownership opportunities, sometimes rental, but more often home ownership opportunities in communities with rising housing prices, so often in gentrifying neighborhoods, and preventing displacement in those neighborhoods. And it does that by acquiring land and then owning. The land trust sells a home at an affordable price to a lower and moderate income household, but in the sale, it retains ownership of the land underneath the house. Because the rising cost of land is one of the primary drivers of increasing housing unaffordability, by taking the land out of the equation, the home price is more affordable. So we talk about in Just Action the Durham Community Land Trust in Durham, North Carolina. It was started by a group of neighbors in a predominantly African American lower income neighborhood in Durham, located near Duke University. And this group started by going door to door and just talking to their neighbors about what they wanted to do to make their community better. And they started identifying, the first thing they identified was that they wanted a park for their kids to play in, because there was no safe place for kids to play. They were playing in the streets, one had gotten hit by a car. So they started advocating that the city turn a vacant lot in their neighborhood into a park. And they won, and the city turned the lot into a park, and they were excited and started to see that they could make a difference in their neighborhood, and looked around to see what else they could do, because their neighborhood was gentrifying. Duke University was expanding. Investors were coming in and buying up their homes. So they learned about a land trust, and they started with 2 properties. Again, they kept ownership of the land under the house and sold the home to lower and moderate income households. And then those households who buy a land trust home, they own it like any other homeowner, but when they go to resell the house, they have to adhere to a maximum resale price that the land trust sets. And that maximum resale price is usually based on a formula, sometimes indexed to inflation. Every land trust does it slightly differently, but they all try to allow the home seller to build some equity while they're selling the home. It's not as much equity, it's limited because they're not able to sell at market rates. But they do gain some equity, and they also ensure that the new home price is still affordable to the next home buying family. So that's how they preserve affordable home ownership in perpetuity over and over. And so in Durham, they now have this land trust, started with the 2 properties. Now they have over 300 in several communities around the city. They're rental and home ownership properties. Those 2 properties they started with sold for $100,000 in today's money when they began. Today, they sell for $150,000, so we can see the affordability has decreased a bit because of that formula, but the surrounding homes in the neighborhood sell for $500,000. So it has attained or retained a lot of affordable prices in that neighborhood. It was also an effective anti-displacement strategy. So the blocks where the land trust was able to acquire property, most of the residents are still African American. But in the surrounding blocks where investors outpaced the land trust, or the land trust couldn't keep up, most of the residents are now white. So we can see that this is an effective strategy for preventing displacement and preserving affordable homeownership. Now, I talk about this as a strategy that can be used in a gentrifying or lower income neighborhood, and that's because that's where land trusts often operate, because that's where they can afford to acquire land, or where the local government will donate vacant land to a land trust. But if a land trust could operate in a suburban community, in an exclusive community, one of these communities that were built for whites only and that have historically prevented African Americans from living in them, if a land trust could acquire property in these communities, it would be a great strategy for opening up those communities to more diversity and to desegregate those communities and to provide affordable homeownership opportunities in those communities to people who've historically been prohibited from living there. The only thing stopping that from happening is that those suburban communities need local groups organized around these issues to advocate that their local government donate vacant land to the land trust. So this is where we all come in as residents of our communities organized for the redress of segregation. We can advocate that our local government donate vacant land to a land trust. There's opportunities in all kinds of communities, vacant land that local government is often sitting on, not knowing what to do about. In suburban communities, we have examples. In Modesto, California, the town now owns a golf course that went out of business, and they're trying to figure out what to do with it. In Woodbridge, Connecticut, a country club, same story. It's vacant. The city now owns it, trying to decide what to do with it. They could donate part of that to a land trust to build affordable homes on it. So that's something we can do as residents of our communities. Also, going back to the restrictive covenants, often those restrictive covenants name the institutions that were involved in the building and first selling of that home when it was first developed. So the restrictive covenant will name on the deed the builder who first built it, the developer, the first realtor who sold it, the bank that financed the development. And communities can do that research, find those institutions. Often those institutions and companies are still in business in communities today. We give some examples in Just Action where we name the companies that were listed on these restrictive covenants, and many of them are still in business. The few that aren't have been acquired by other companies that are in business today. And so we argue that a group that's advocating for the redress of segregation would find these companies and institutions and pressure them to contribute to remedies for the segregation that they help to create. And one of the ways they can contribute to remedies is by donating to a land trust, resources or vacant land. So that's one example. I think I have time to get into another one. Another example has to do with Section 8. So this is an example of a strategy that helps to open up exclusive, expensive, usually predominantly white communities to diverse residents. So that is possible, potentially, with the Section 8 program. So Section 8, housing choice vouchers, it's the largest rental subsidy program in the country. It's funded by HUD, by the federal government, but administered by local public housing authorities. So there's a lot of say that the local housing authority has in how that program is run. So Section 8 was designed with the intent and the potential to help low-income families move out of high-poverty neighborhoods, because unlike public housing, where the benefit comes in a building, a unit that's tied to a specific place, with Section 8, the recipient can use that voucher to rent a unit anywhere in the private market in the jurisdiction of their local public housing authority, and sometimes outside of that jurisdiction. So it allows for what we call mobility for lower income tenants to move out of high poverty areas. That's the potential, the sort of promise of Section 8. But only 5% of Section 8 families use their vouchers to live in what are called high opportunity neighborhoods. So those are neighborhoods with well-resourced schools, access to public space, with healthy air, good grocery stores, access to jobs. Only 5% of the 2 million Section 8 households use their vouchers to live up to the potential of the program. And of those 5%, white voucher holders are more likely to be able to do that than African American voucher holders. Several reasons for that. One is discrimination. So on the federal level, it's legal to discriminate against Section 8 tenants because they use Section 8 to pay their rent. It's a legal form of discrimination. But many states and localities, including DC, have adopted what are called source of income discrimination laws that say that it's illegal to discriminate against a tenant based on where their income comes from, including Section 8 vouchers. But passing a law like that is just the first step. In places around the country that have these laws, we still see ads for available units that say no Section 8 allowed, or there's more subtle forms of discrimination. In some places, they say, sure, we allow you to use Section 8, but you have to have an income that's 4 times the monthly rent. And that's impossible for Section 8 because by definition, they don't have that income. They're lower income tenants. Their voucher helps them pay their rent. So that's a way that landlords get around these anti-discrimination ordinances. So a local group organized to redress segregation could take this on, either helping to pass an anti-discrimination law if one doesn't exist, or if one does, helping make sure that it's enforced. And the enforcement of those laws often falls to fair housing organizations or civil rights organizations. They need resources to be able to do this important work. They often are under-resourced, so we can support them that way. They also usually find this type of discrimination by sending testers. They do what's called paired testing to find where discrimination is occurring. So they send a white applicant and an African-American applicant with similar qualifications. Maybe some say they have Section 8 and some don't, and see how they're treated by the landlords. Some might be offered a unit, some might be told that it's already been rented before they even learn anything about the tenant. And that's how we can find where discrimination is happening, and then it can be prosecuted and enforced. Those anti-discrimination laws can be enforced that way. But fair housing organizations need volunteers to be those testers. So that's another way individually we can contribute to remedies for segregation by volunteering to help find where this discrimination is occurring so we can stop it. So that's one way we can contribute towards the Section 8 program being an effective desegregation effort to allow low-income tenants more mobility to high-opportunity neighborhoods. Now, another way is how the Section 8 program works is a low-income tenant will pay 30% of their monthly rent, of their monthly income towards their rent, and the voucher makes up the difference up to a maximum voucher amount. And that maximum amount is set at 40% of the median rent of the entire metropolitan area. So you take a metropolitan area that has which most do, a wide range of rents, the lowest to highest, you go right in the middle, 10% below that is the maximum rent a voucher holder can afford. So that means by definition over half of the rents in the metropolitan area are out of reach to voucher holders. Not surprisingly, those are often in the higher cost or higher opportunity areas of the region. So in 2010, there was a lawsuit about this issue in Dallas. It alleged that this payment standard required or caused the isolation and segregation of low-income African-American and Hispanic voucher holders into high-poverty areas. And as a result of this lawsuit, a new payment standard was adopted in the Dallas area where the voucher pays more in high-cost areas of the region and less in low-cost areas of the region. So smaller area rent standard is what it's called, small area fair market rent. So the voucher goes farther in high-opportunity areas than in high-poverty areas, which makes sense and allowed for a lot of mobility of voucher holders. And so after that sort of trial period with the Dallas program, now 180 housing authorities in 25 metropolitan areas around the country are required to use this small area rent standard. One of them is here in the DC region. So that means that here voucher holders their voucher goes farther in high opportunity areas, which is helpful, but there's still obstacles. These are all like small steps getting to the final goal. It doesn't mean that landlords are falling over themselves in high opportunity areas to rent to voucher holders. So there's more that can be done in that way. We can work to recruit landlords to rent to voucher holders, to dispel some of the myths. We've talked to landlords in our research for this book who prefer voucher holders as tenants because they're more stable. They don't move as often, they take better care of their property. So these are the kinds of, this is not often what landlords think about voucher holders. So we can, organize to work with landlords to be more willing to rent to voucher holders. And there's also, I know last time I was here, we were talking about this, there's administrative changes that can be done at the local housing authority or the local city level that can help make it easier for landlords to participate in the program. There's often a lot of administrative hurdles. So in each region, a group working on this issue could investigate what it is that's keeping landlords from participating in the program, and then start to tackle those issues one at a time by advocating that their local housing authorities make these changes. So those are a couple of examples, and let's see, we have a lot more. We have a lot that cover like home ownership, increasing home ownership for African Americans. And the restrictive covenants we've been talking about are one way that African Americans, an obvious, explicit way that they've been kept out of home ownership in the past. But there are less obvious, less explicit ways that are still in practice today that make it hard for African Americans to get into home ownership and to be first-time home buyers. One of those is the credit scoring system. So this is an example of a policy, a program that is not racially discriminatory on its face or in its intent, but it is in its effect because we have an unequal society. So this policy that's, applied equally has unequal effects, disparate impacts on African Americans. And that's because the way the credit scoring system works is, it tells a bank that you're a good qualifying candidate for a mortgage if you have a good credit score. If you don't, or if you have no credit score or a low credit score, it's unlikely you'll be able to get a mortgage and get into home ownership. So your credit score is based on your financial history, how well you've paid your debts in the past, and that makes some sense. But it's only based on a certain type of financial history, and it's a type of financial history that whites are far more likely to have than African Americans. So a white household applying for a mortgage is far more likely to have owned a home in the past than an African American household who's more likely to have been a renter. And past mortgage payments factor into your credit score, but past rental payments do not. So if you've been a renter your whole life, have never missed a rent payment, have never been late on a bill, that doesn't factor into your credit score. And so as a result, so that's one aspect. Also, African American neighborhoods have fewer bank branches than white neighborhoods, even neighborhoods of similar economic status and income makeup of its residents. And so African Americans have to rely more often on non-traditional financial institutions like payday lenders. And those payday lenders have exorbitant interest rates. And even if they pay off those debts with those exorbitant interest rates, those payoffs don't factor into a credit score either. So the result that we have is that about a third of African Americans have no credit score, so they don't have enough of this qualifying credit to even translate into a score, compared to 17% of whites. And of those with a credit score, about 21% of African Americans have a high enough credit score to be eligible for a mortgage, compared to over half of whites. So this is, again, the disparate impact of what's seeming to be a race-neutral program. And so there's talk and there's some movement federally with the credit scoring systems or federal systems, nationwide systems, and there's some movement. We've just been learning more since we've been in DC this week about new developments in changing the credit scoring algorithms through Fannie and Freddie. But what we argue is that federal change is slow and probably not completely comprehensive to count all rental payment history. So what we can do in our own communities is work with our local bank branches and local credit unions to start to factor in rental payment history in their own calculations of credit scores when they're assessing if somebody is a good candidate for a mortgage. And doing that, we give some examples in Just Action of bank branches and credit unions doing that. So it's possible to work on that local level on this issue. And that goes a long way in opening up home ownership opportunities for African Americans. So those are a few examples. We have a lot more that I'm sure we could get more into in the Q&A, and there's a lot more in our book, and a lot more we couldn't write about, and a lot more we're learning about since we wrote the book. So we have a Substack newsletter that we're continuing to write about these issues and update them as we learn about them. So I hope that gives you some idea, and I hope what you all here and online and readers of our book are left with is that this may be an overwhelming problem where decades of policy went into creating segregation, but that doesn't mean that there's nothing we can do about it now. It might feel overwhelming, but there's actually a lot that we can do to start to chip away at the issue and start to make progress. So we just have to get started with any one of these ideas, and so that's it, and we'll continue talking about it now.
Before we go to the questions, I'll just give a couple of other examples to show you how widespread this is. As I mentioned before, and as Leah emphasized, when you have two groups of people, different in circumstances, race-neutral policies can be discriminatory in effect, and they're ripe for local action to remedy. One of the most powerful ones, one of the most influential ones, is the way in which property tax assessors assess properties. In almost every community in this country, and I really mean it, almost every one, there are very few exceptions, African American homeowners pay property taxes at a higher rate than white homeowners do. They pay property taxes at a higher rate than white homeowners do because assessors don't go into homes. They just look at them from the outside. They don't frequently do a visual reassessment annually, maybe a few years lag between assessments. Properties in white neighborhoods appreciate faster than the properties in black neighborhoods. So if you don't do a very rapid reassessment every year, the market values of homes in white neighborhoods are going to rise higher than their assessed values than the market values of homes in black neighborhoods. That means that African Americans are paying a property tax that's a higher percentage of the market value of their homes than white homeowners are. In many cases, the property taxes are one of the final straws that break the camel's back and force people into foreclosure because they can't afford their property taxes. Well, a Chicago economist has calculated the average overtaxation of African American neighborhoods in every community in this country, almost every community in this country. So you can look it up. And a local action group could demand refunds, could campaign for refunds, perhaps starting politely and then ending up not so politely for homeowners in black neighborhoods who have been overpaying taxes and subsidizing public services while white homeowners are paying less, not because it's an intentionally racial system, but because these two different communities, one appreciates faster than the other. Property assessors don't go into homes. They can't tell that homes in white neighborhoods have more amenities, more up-to-date appliances, fewer lagged maintenance problems that would affect the value of the home. And so you get a disparate impact of a race-neutral assessment system that's ripe for direct action on the part of a community group to redress. One of many, many other examples. Are we going to take questions about it? How are you going to do it?
I'm happy to moderate if you want to
Sure. Okay.
direct to folks.
I'll take one of the mics.
Okay. And how do you turn this on? Turn this on like this? Okay. Do you want to come up here, Leah?
Good afternoon, and thank you both for the talk. I'm super interested to read the book. My question is about the community land trusts and that model, and thinking explicitly about how it works for suburban communities and how it might disrupt segregation. I'm wondering, one, what do you think the prospect is for folks who live in those communities to like have their own homes be a part of the community land trust? If that's what's the scope of that? Because I'm worried that folks will see this model and not want to, I guess, cap the appreciation of their own homes, right? Because that will be a part of it, I assume. And if that's not the case, is that a limiting factor on how much the community can segregate, right? How do you convince people to make that decision?
Well, the land trust model, I haven't seen it work with current homeowners that they would then cap their equity share. It's more the new homeowners in the house that's turned over to the land trust. They get it at an affordable price. So they get it at a price, they can buy into it in a way that they wouldn't be able to buy another home in the community because it's more affordable and it's capped and ensuring that it's affordable to a lower moderate income household. And it is a trade-off. So in order, they get the benefit of getting into home ownership for affordable price, and then the trade-off is that they have a maximum resale price that they can sell it for, so their equity is somewhat limited. And every land trust, strikes that balance differently. The Durham example I gave, they started by capping the resale price a lot more restrictively, so the homeowner didn't really build much equity at all. And there was some backlash and opposition from the African American community saying we want to be able to earn some more equity in home ownership just like white homeowners can. And so they adjusted their formula to allow some more equity building. But the more equity they're allowed to build, the more subsidy the land trust has to put in at every resale. So it's just a balance that every community strikes differently. And it's just one strategy for creating affordable home ownership opportunities. So it might not be the one that one community likes because of that restricted resale price. So then there's other strategies like subsidies for African Americans to buy homes, or down payment assistance programs, or favorable mortgages, or inclusionary zoning, you know, for home ownership development. So it's just one idea, and they all have, you know, benefits and limitations.
Let me just add one thing to this very briefly. Appreciation in home value is not the only way you gain equity from owning a home. If you have a long-term mortgage, over time, more and more of your payment each month goes towards equity that you're accumulating. So it's not as though even if there was no, even if there was a total restriction on resale price, homeowners in this land trust model would still gain some equity from just paying off a mortgage.
In today's New York Times, Edsel has a great column on the significantly increasing diversity of suburbs, while acknowledging the continuing discrimination that occurs in suburbs. But he concludes by saying that this might be a positive development for the Democrats, because the suburbs are becoming increasingly democratic because of the diversity. I just wonder if you have any thoughts about the changing demography of cities and suburbs over the last 40 or 50 years. This isn't directly related to the kinds of things you talked about in the book, but it's something I'm sure you can about.
Well, there are suburbs and suburbs. Inner ring suburbs have experienced a growth in the non-white population. At the same time, they've experienced white flight of the remaining whites. And so inner ring suburbs tend to be diverse for a period of time, and then that diversity is lost. In Just Action, we describe how communities can stabilize their desegregation by intentional policies. There are many policies that they can employ. One example that we give in Just Action is Oak Park, Illinois, that has had a very intentional, stabilized desegregation program for almost 40 years now. And one of the innovative things that Oak Park did was the city established an equity insurance program that would assure homeowners that they would not have to flee if they were afraid, white homeowners, they wouldn't have to flee if, because their property values would decline if African Americans moved in. The program was suspended after, I think, about 20 years, was it? Something like that, because they never had to pay a benefit to it. Home prices never declined, even though Oak Park's racial composition today is identical to that of the entire Chicago metropolitan area. We describe some other communities also that have embarked on intentional stabilization programs. So this is all possible. Outer ring suburbs continue to be overwhelmingly white. And one of the problems that we address in the book is that one of the ways we obfuscate this reality is by talking about diversity as though you can have a diverse community with no African Americans, because a lot of high-income Asians have moved in. And we've got a lot of suburbs that are doing that today. I haven't read Edsel's column yet.
Well, I have two questions. That's okay. So right now the district council is considering the community land trust bill, and a lot of the, I guess, sort of conjecture that's going on is that we have a neighboring metropolitan that has a ground rent program that has not been successful, so they don't want to see community land trust with that ground rent program. So have you guys kind of looked at that and like the comparisons of those two, and then in the implementation of community land trust? And then my second question is, have you seen community land trust be implemented to commercial builders and commercial buildings?
I'm not familiar with the ground rent program, so I can't speak to that. I haven't seen community land trusts in commercial areas, so like converting commercial land to housing.
Or actually just putting commercial land for businesses.
Like a land trust for commercial land.
Yeah,
we were pretty focused on housing for a long time, so I haven't seen that, but I kind of, yeah, and I had something else to say, completely forgot. I think it would work in the same way, where they hold the ownership of the land and then have a more affordable price for the building. It's a great model. And we have, we do talk some in the book about these different strategies that are kind of overlaid with each other. So I mentioned really briefly inclusionary zoning, and that's when, a jurisdiction through its zoning code requires that when new development happens, that a certain percentage of the units have to be affordable, and those are often rental developments and for sale developments. And so when they're for sale developments, sometimes they partner with the land trust. So the inclusionary units, say a new development happens, it has to have 20 units reserved to be sold at affordable prices. They'll turn over those units to a land trust to manage the ongoing affordability. And that's the way these strategies can kind of be layered on top of each other.
I'm curious about the question of financialization of housing to begin with. And if there's been any models that you've seen of communities kind of fighting to stop that hyper-commercialization of housing, and I don't know, the fact that there's so much equity tied up in homes, it's become a source of intergenerational wealth and speculative investing. So I'm curious, because I think we're on, I don't know, based on what I've observed, a housing bubble is imminent, and there's a housing crisis in many of our metropolitan areas. So yeah, I'm curious what you guys think about that process of capital being so tied up into housing, and what models communities have offered to teach.
I don't know that we've thought of any models to deal with that particular issue aside from the land trust one. Most of the problems with that model are federal, national, and we're almost entirely focused on what you can do in your own communities to get this process started.
And just an idea that I'm working on, I haven't figured it out yet, but a lot of communities are seeing a lot of large, investors that are not local buying up huge amounts of single-family homes, turning them into rental units. And I think there's maybe a way for a jurisdiction to regulate that in some way. Owner of over X number of units in a city has to, have an inclusionary requirement. A certain number of those units have to be affordable, something like that. So it's something if anybody has ideas about that, talk to me.
Yes, hello. I was wondering if you thought about for local people who want to work on these issues, the pluses and minuses of starting new organizations or working with sort of existing organizations that have historically focused on housing. Are there pluses and minuses to those approaches?
Well, most organizations, not all, there are places where there are grassroots organizations that you could join, but most organizations working on housing are developing policy. They're not mobilizing people to force that policy to be enacted. And the ideas in this book, nothing in this book is new. All the policy ideas have been developed. What's missing is those 20 million people getting out of their homes and beginning to meet with each other and create activist committees and doing something to force the implementation of those well-known policies.
I'm just so overwhelmed and impressed about the whole presentation and about both of you. I haven't read the book yet, but it just, you combine not only the depth of research, but with an organizer sensibility to understand you have to have the power to actually make the research make sense, sort of back to the answer you were just giving. But I'm also so impressed not only for how impactful your research has been, but just this feeling of the issue, of understanding it at a deeper level because of what you've described. And then honestly, I'm just so touched by the father-daughter relationship of passing it on also one generation to another. And because this has been such a generational problem, probably to the country's founding, but at least since the New Deal, as you described it before. I wondered if you had, and you may be frustrated by this question, I wondered if you had a projection for however long you think it could take, of how you think all the separate parts and pieces come together. And I know you are building an organization, this Redress Project, of helping people figure out how you do it in community after community. But do you have a vision of how the parts might come together to actually spark our imagination nationally to make the kind of change that would be needed at the level that would be needed, because it does feel so overwhelming, and you're giving us the first practical way to at least begin addressing the problem.
Well, let me start by saying that we don't have a projection. I think it's premature. I have been associated with this group you refer to, the Redress Movement. It's put organizers to create these kinds of local actions in 3 cities, Milwaukee, Charlotte, North Carolina, and Denver. And our hope is, and this is not a long-term hope, but it's a medium-term hope, our hope is that as groups like this make victories, they will be imitated. And that's the way this will grow. Nobody, the Redress Movement, which is an organization that I was associated with starting, is not going to be able to put organizers in 100 cities or 500 cities. But if it scores victories, it will inspire people in other places to do it, and that will make this more possible. These policies that we've described, I think we should not underestimate how much the redress of segregation can take place at a local level, because although the segregation was created by federal policy, as the examples that Leah and I have described, it's sustained by local policy in many cases. And a lot of these campaigns that we've described, and a lot of them, by the way, are directed at, well, I think mentioned this, are directed at the private firms whose predecessors created the segregation. A lot of these make a small difference, but when you add them all up, they make a pretty significant difference in how segregated we are. So, no, I don't have any idea how long it will take, but I guess if all of you start moving, that will make it just a little bit shorter.
How do we get connected to the Redress Project?
Redressmovement.org. Yeah, check them out, get in contact with them there. And I'll just add, I also don't have a projected timeline, but working on this project has been really a hopeful experience for me and heartening experience, because in the book we give examples for all of these policies of a community that's working on it or successfully implemented it. And so there are these small steps being taken across the country. My hope is that with this book, people will read it and say, oh, that's something we need here. I'm going to contact that group and see how they did it, and start those conversations across the country. And I'm going to add one more thing. Might not agree about this particular piece, but I'm going to say it anyway. I was, perusing, skimming Color of Law before leaving on this book tour, just to refresh my memory. And one of the frequently asked questions in that book was about reparations, and should we be talking about reparations? And my dad's answer to that question then in 2017 was, we can't start talking about reparations until we reckon with our history and understand the responsibility government played in creating this, and how, the unconstitutional nature of it. Now we get almost in every crowd a question about reparations. There's programs called reparations programs being talked about across the country. I'm from California, there's a statewide task force. So a lot of movement has been made since he answered that question in Color of Law. I think it means we are reckoning with the past in a new way. And I don't know what will come of these reparations conversations and programs, and we have a whole reason we don't use the term reparation. We talk about remedies, but I do think that in terms of the timeline, I think we're moving forward on this issue, and I think the fact that we are reckoning with this past in a new way and in a more honest way means that we can start implementing more changes that are necessary to move forward. So that's my hopeful piece.
One more question I think we could take.
Thank you for this. I'm curious, you mentioned very early on over-policing as one of the ways that a lack of safety and segregation is reinforced, and we see that now with white people in particular deploying the police in ways that keep Black people who live in those spaces maintain the whiteness of those spaces. I'm wondering if any of the examples in the book that you've encountered in terms of these layered strategies, are any of these groups using, I'm asking this question badly, sorry, but are there strategies that have been impactful to increase the safety of Black people in these spaces as they desegregate, so that like the whiteness isn't maintained in other ways and safety isn't decreased for people who are moving into the spaces?
It is a good question. I would say we don't, sort of indirectly we talk about it in, we give 3 examples, like my dad mentioned of Oak Park, examples of communities, you know, in the 1950s who took on intentionally desegregating their communities. Their issues were slightly different. It maybe wasn't done with police, it was done with realtors. But they went, you know, door to door, they talked to their neighbors and they dispelled the myths to the white residents of those communities about what it means to live in a diverse neighborhood, and they introduced people to each other and had social events and, you know, had paired white people with African American home seekers to sort of escort them and make sure they were treated fairly. So I think the lesson we can learn from that is it's the sort of fabric of the issues right now are slightly different, but it takes the same kind of social engagement and meeting each other and understanding that we're similar and we're not, you know, we're not people to be feared, and then creating safety that way through our community connections and social connections.
I'll just add this one thing to that answer. There's a lot more support in these white communities than you would think. It's not organized. The NIMBYs, the Not in My Backyards, are much more vocal. Leah wrote, she mentioned we have a Substack column to update events that we describe in this book. It comes out every 2 weeks. It's free, and if you go onto Substack and look it up, it's Just Action, and you'll find it. Leah wrote one a few weeks ago about a very, very elite white community where the NIMBYs put on the ballot. Did you already talk about this? No. NIMBYs put on the ballot a measure that would prohibit any upzoning in the community in perpetuity virtually. And they thought that the few racial justice supporters thought they were going to lose, and they wound up winning the referendum by going door to door, knocking on people's homes, and finding that there was actually a majority in this very elite, the average price of the homes in this community was $2 million. This very elite white community, they found there was majority support for desegregation. So there's a lot, and like I said at the beginning, the 20 million people, a lot of them are suburban. You know, I can go on and on with examples of this, but one of the themes of this book is that you know, we can't be out-organized, and there's a lot of support for racial justice in this country that is quiet and that we can mobilize.
I just want to add again. I just think that, yeah, the hostility of whites to African Americans moving into predominantly white neighborhoods is a real thing. And like my dad said, organizing the white people in that community who don't think that that's an okay response is what needs to happen. And we didn't write about this, I haven't been talking about this, but I recall in my neighborhood when Nextdoor, is Nextdoor a thing out here? When that started, we respond, you know, Nextdoor is this community listserv thing, and it's often been a very racially charged platform. And in response, we joined little groups. We started little groups in our community to like, what can we do? Because this isn't okay. This is what's under the surface of our neighbors. And so that, maybe that's the issue that a community starts with.
I just want to thank Richard and Leah for this great presentation. I love that you really drilled down into the states and localities and what local advocates can do and the need for organizing. And we'll just give a little plug for EPI's own state and local network, EARN, Economic Analysis and Research Network, that's led by Dave Cooper, who I saw somewhere, and Michael Shotley. And represents about 60 groups all around the country, and some of them are working on these housing issues, and I think are going to be really excited to hear the lessons that are coming out of these other areas. So thank you so much. Let's give them one more big hand. And so we'll close this down, and we'll ask Leah and Richard to come out and sign some books. So thanks, everybody.